Okay, we're going to get started. And I'm going to first introduce our guest, Jan Priisalu. He's a researcher in Tallinn University of Technology and senior fellow of the NATO CCD-COE. I hope I spelled it right. His main research interest is critical infrastructure protection and exercises. He's also former general director of the Estonian Information System Authority, a member of the Estonian Information System Audit Association, and co-founder of the Estonian Defense League Cyber Unit. We are very proud to have here Joanna Jõekalda, who is a young Estonian architect, and together with Meri-Kris Jaama, they're working in their research studio, right? On virtual reality and brain tracking experiments. Basically, what they're doing is they're trying to deal with human perception, and their research topic was also into her master thesis. And at the last Biennale, she curated the Estonian Pavilion Interspace that speculated on the spatial consequences of data society. So I would like to kickstart this conversation by asking a common question, perhaps, which is that Stephen asked before, who writes the rules in the city? And Jarmo asked, who are the managers of the city, right? And also Lev shown the importance of singularities. And so what I wanted to ask to the panel is, indeed, who are the managers? So when we have the data owned by companies and data collected through platforms, or even in the case of Airbnb, we have all this information, indeed, again, by an agency that doesn't even own let's say, its stocks, but it just kind of manages data and connects infrastructure to people. Who are the managers of the city? Maybe who want to start? Maybe Jarmo wants to, please.
Why me? There is not a clear answer for that. Let's say that the battle is on in a way. Mm-hmm. The integrator model is, of course, something which the bigger companies are aiming for. Google basically wants to index the world. That's the outspoken target of them. So we might have, as the final outcome, different models. We might have the landscape where most of our data is hosted by large integrators which work in their respective domains, but it's not linked and it's not transparent for us. Then it could be that it gets splintered and the national governments demand that they need to do that, which is a bad choice also because they are pretty bad at it normally. Mm-hmm. So I would maybe, if I would need to have to say a wish, so I can't answer. Okay. There is not an answer, simple answer for that at the moment because it's in flux. Mm-hmm. But what would be a nice answer is that we would have a landscape where I could control my data wherever it is, and both private and public entities would have to let me do it. Right. I would have a chance to opt out and see everything which is done with it. Mm-hmm. And that probably demands some new kind of organizations which would help us to do that, because to set that landscape up by ourselves is too cumbersome a task. But data managing operators or data managing helpers.
Maybe I will actually...
Something like that.
Perhaps I will share the microphone, otherwise it will be much harder to have a conversation. Please, okay, I'll offer as well. Otherwise, if we speak once at a time. Yeah, okay. Please.
Yeah. Well, so, I like your question, but there is also something, I would say, maybe a bit old-fashioned about the question, because it assumes that the city needs a manager. I mean, right, the reason people like Rem Koolhaas was going to Lagos every year, because it's like, okay, nobody manages Lagos, and yet it's like actually very functional in its own way, right? So why does the city need a manager? But I would say, I think, but at the same time, I think if we look at this historically, in 2000s and actually 1990s, there was lots of discussion, like, do states still exist? Or do we have these global companies which operate kind of across, right, on a planetary scale? And when people said, well, yeah, but there's taxation regimes in different countries, you have visa, you have borders, and I think the same thing goes to the city. I mean, yeah, you have data, you have physical things, but ultimately, who manages the city? It's a very simple answer. It's whoever, okay, there's a chief of police, whoever chief of police reports to, this person manages the city. Ultimately, to me, managing means policing something, right? Because police can go and arrest you, etc., fine you, And so to that extent, my feeling is in 10 years, we'll say, we thought that city is going to be managed by data companies. No, actually it's managed by the mayor and the police.
But could you say that when you look at your data, social media data, could you say that somehow people are rewriting this rule by themselves sometimes? Or can you say that the sort of manager of the city, can they read and invent new rules through that data?
Well, I think one beautiful example which I kind of wanted to show is that, which relates to this idea of kind of questioning our existing concepts, right? So to me, the most interesting two papers which have been published so far among thousands of papers about big data, city, etc., where we basically use location data from Foursquare. And then we said, well, actually, the way a real city operates is not according to the kind of neighborhoods which you see on the map, but if you look at where people go, right, which locations we favor, you'll find our type of neighborhoods which kind of cut across the neighborhoods on the map, and you also find the different parts of the city have affinity, even though you wouldn't know it from a map, right? So it's a kind of way to discover how a city really operates using kind of data from bottom up, as opposed to taking, let's say, for granted, okay, here Tallinn stops, or here is this city, right? Here is this area. So the city, the data is in a way to empirically, I think, better understand how things work. Whether we have any connection to what we think our rules are or what we think our official boundaries are.
Steven, maybe you want to give your perspective.
Yeah, obviously it's a very complicated question because in many ways we're giving away lots of our data voluntarily because we're posting to social media all the time. And we're giving away data to lots of different kinds of organization. Our government has some of the data, the city municipal authorities have some of the data, American companies have some of the data, so there's not one overarching authority that sort of protects data users' rights, and I don't know whether maybe there should be some kind of UN authority, but at the moment it's very, I like this idea that one should be able to demand, people who hold your data, one should be able to demand to know what they're doing with it, and that you should be able to look at it in the way that people can demand to see their old Secret Service files on them, in Britain that were held in 30 years ago. But unless we do something like that, it seems that things are going to get worse. Already in America, there's this vast data brokerage industry. So you get all this data being sold on and sold around and hoovered up, and you get things like, I read in this book by Bernard Harcourt, Exposed, he was talking about this data brokerage company in America that sells lists of names of Alzheimer's sufferers, of rape victims, all kinds, they've classified and they've got 10,000 of these names and they sell them to pharmaceutical companies who can then spam them with their offers. And that's the kind of thing that happens to people's data if nobody's managing where it goes and what rights people have over it.
Yeah, for instance, myself, I'm using one app, it's called OpenPath, and allows you to track your self-location through all the year long. But what this app does, in difference with others, is that anytime some researchers or companies wants to use this data, you actually receive a message, and you say that this company wants to use this data to make this research. Do you allow us to distribute your data? And then I can say yes or no. Of course, it's kind of demanding because I get one email every week. So every week I get some researchers saying, can we use your data? But I think that...
Sounds like an extra administrative burden on the user, doesn't it?
Yes, right. But at least it kind of gives me this kind of... It makes me choose if I want that or not. It gives me a choice, right? So maybe this kind of... Also the concept of privacy, maybe you can say something about how do we relate to this privacy when it's about the data? Or maybe the notion of privacy is maybe the issue here, because everybody is sharing anyway, and the data is public and can be used. So maybe you can say more about.
Yes. No, my belief is that that data privacy is now well defined. That I understand that it's written into the Declaration of the Human Rights that the data privacy is defined as a confidentiality. But beside the confidentiality, there are two other security properties of the data and systems. It's availability and integrity. And how it seems to me is that the privacy is actually the problem there is not that data is used, that can be cured by the confidentiality, but the problem is that data is misused. That is, in the essence, is the integrity question. And the trick with that is that, the methods to solve those two things are totally different. And exactly like you said, actually, that you will receive some kind of notice. I think that if everybody will ask whether they can use your data or not, actually, you cannot answer to them manually. These things must be automated. But it can be done in the way like you are having in the banking system, that bank is answering to all those kind of questions, whether they are paying the money on behalf of you or not, and then bank is accountable for you. So same things can be done also to the data, and of course in the case of the misuse, you need such kind of thing as data police. And to your original question, who is controlling the city or who is making the rules? Now, if we are if you are implementing, what is the rule set? The rule set is basically the artificial intelligence in the way that some people understand it. And if you are writing more complex algorithms, then those algorithms will manage. And how to judge whether they are doing it well or not is actually gather again some data, what are the consequences of using those algorithms, and whether people like it or not. And the other bad thing about the confidentiality is that confidentiality creates this private property also. And if you are raising this bar or raising this confidentiality level, then those guys who can jump the fence, they are getting enormous advantage. So I believe that there should be the least confidentiality possible.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. Joanna, maybe you want to intervene?
Just a bottom line comment that I find that in Estonia, the balance between the top-down and bottom-up approaches is, I think, pretty good, given that the data that the state owns is really used for the sake of environment and for the sake of people's everyday activities. In case of big companies, it's always used to make profit. And just to reflect on that, I find that we cannot really prefer either of the extremes, but just a balance of those two approaches.
Yeah. Jarmo, you wanted to wrap up?
Maybe just a quick comment about the there's one pretty clear thing about management, if you call it that, or governance, which I think we should keep quite strongly in our heads, and that is that exceedingly our data forms a vulnerable part of us. And I think that when we discuss regulation and we discuss different ways to manage and operate the data, we should also remember that there's basically one entity in most countries which has a legal right to practice violence, and that is the government. And that's something we should never give to anyone else. Because, then we step into really thin ice if we outsource this sort of a policing aspect, for example, to other parties than the governance. Of course, there are bad governments, but those are governments which practice the division of powers principles and sort of respect democracy. They should, the regulation should always be on top of whichever structures we build. And I think we might sometimes forget that it's possible to do violence against our data. And it should be illegal and it should be regulated if that happens.
All right. So basically we need to also try to think about having this sort of governance of data. So not just the governance of the city, but the governance of the data, and try to make sure that it's structured in a very democratic way. But then if it's too open, then we get into a kind of loophole. Or
I don't think it's a question of whether it's open or not open.
Right.
That depends on the person. If the system works well, it's up to me to decide how transparent I am, for example. If I then make stupid decisions, then I might make stupid decisions about all this. The trick is that I should be able to do that consciously.
okay, that's right.
I agree. It's true that privacy is ill-defined in this new age, and it encompasses various different things. But I think it does encompass the decision not to be transparent if you don't want to. I think most people would understand by privacy the idea that if you choose, you can choose not to leave a trace. And that's something that's increasingly difficult in this day and age, not to leave any trace. And I think that should be a right. It's not this, it's allied to the notion of anonymity, which of course can be abused. But I think the idea that you can't hide anywhere from, you know, the surveillance apparatus is one that makes most people uncomfortable. But we need to have a sort of big public debate and a renegotiation of what privacy means for the citizen now, because as it stands, you go on a website or you use an app, if you click on privacy policy, that's not a negotiation, they're just telling you all the ways in which they plan to infringe your privacy, and you can either just say yes or don't use the service. So, you know, we don't currently have much choice in the matter, and we should have more.
Yeah, that's correct, and maybe it can even be an ethical question. I mean, I just want to bring maybe one short example. Last week I was in London doing a workshop, and I gave to students all the Instagram and Twitter data, and we were just analyzing where people do what in the city, and at some point I asked them, okay, now select certain subjects and follow them, because it's very easy. You just take one, just make a query. You just take one person identity, and you start to see where he took pictures during the entire year. And I knew I wanted to create this kind of situation where people told me, students told me, like, I don't want to do that. So it was kind of very interesting to me to see that nobody wanted to do it, because they felt themselves like, oh, damn, I've been doing this 1 year, so somebody else like me could track myself as well. So I think, could it be that maybe it's more, I mean, there is also a question of ethics in terms of the job that we are carrying out. Is there, privacy is one side and ethics is another? Maybe we should try to find the right balance between the two of them, or not? Or what do you think about it?
Still, actually, coming back to to this not leaving the trace, I don't believe into it. When we worked with the logs, actually, then the guys who tried to hide themselves, even this fact that they are hiding themselves is leaving so apparent hole in the data, what is moving. So from all the surroundings, you can see that this hole is moving, and it's very uniquely identified.
That's a nice paradox. So it's like if you install like 50 locks on your front door and metal shutters in the window because you want to protect your privacy, that's going to be very conspicuous, and people are going to think, well, what have you got to hide?
Joanna?
Yeah, I think also before at the table when we were having a short introductory discussion, we were quickly reaching the point that the only option could be to have most of the data public, because this is the only version where it couldn't be misused by someone who has the monopoly for it. Or that would be the short comment for the privacy concerns that...
Or not to live in city.
Yes.
Yeah, because in the city you are sharing all the resources, and all this sharing actually needs the data to do it well, and this sharing leaves a trace. You must own everything. You must be self-sufficient and not share anything with other people.
Yes, please.
It's I think during the coming years, or even years, at least decades, but probably already years, one of the things which some parts of the discussion will appear funny in hindsight, and the people become more used to use their privacy or their information as a tool of exchange, tool of trade. The challenge, of course, now is that we are selling it cheap, mostly. So we get pretty little compared to what we give out. And that's, of course, very beneficial for the platform operator, but that's something which we probably should be able to change to be a bit more balanced.
Yeah, please.
Well, I want to bring a bit of trouble to the conversation. And so I want to ask, so this question of privacy, right, which is always discussed in relation to data. And I wonder if it's actually relevant at all to a larger world, because if you live in these 20 or 30 advanced capitalist countries, with kind of middle-class existence, you can worry about the data, who's going to use your data, or you can be living in the rest of the world where you're lucky to have your $4 a day job, and I think I don't think privacy enters into the picture, So are we just being very kind of local, provincial, and spending so much energy? Basically, we say we care about our life, we don't really care about the life of, the rest 5 billion people. Where privacy, you need to have something on the table for dinner before you can talk about privacy, So it's, I think, a bit of a relevant issue worldwide, in a global sense. I mean, I also want to say, I also want to maybe a bit make trouble for you, where I'm also wondering about the thing about hacking, right? Because I think ultimately you can say, okay, when the way humanity developed, think about medieval cities. You had fires, you had plagues, where like 2/3 of Europe were like wiped out, right? So in the industrial age, you had accidents, like this thing would just blow off. And people just lived with it, and nobody even thought you could control it. Right? So now we're basically trying to do what we try to maybe, bring Paul Virilio, is we're trying to control accidents. Why? Because we live in a fed societies dominated by insurance companies. So once insurance companies show up in the 19th century and start using statistics, because we want to control accident. So what's so awful if like the city gets hacked and 50,000 people can't get to work or there's a fire? I mean, how is it important? How is it a big deal in comparison to like Middle Ages where like 70% of Europe would just like die in one day? So are we actually being intellectual, thinking for ourselves, or are we thinking for insurance companies? So again, it's just a kind of a big question mark, right? Like in other words, with things which we think are important, are we actually important for us? Or are we important for insurance companies? And maybe as intellectuals, we should be discussing something totally different. So not a criticism, but a question mark, if you don't mind.
I mean, I agree that life is much better than it was in the Middle Ages, and I'm happy about that. Well, in some ways, in terms of in terms of your chance of surviving throughout a given day. But if I'm going to get into a driverless car, I think I want to know whether it can be hacked so that, some guy who doesn't like me is going to make it crash off the road and kill me, or whether it's been programmed by Google to drive off the bridge to save the school bus full of children. I mean, you can imagine if the city's infrastructure does become that hackable, then, it's not just about blackouts, as, Edward Lucas said in his book. It's about turning the sewage pumps off to poison millions of people. People can get very sick or die. So there are potential catastrophes which may have a small chance of actually occurring, but nonetheless we should think about them, just as the chance of an asteroid crashing into Earth is a very tiny probability, but it would be a cataclysmic event, so we should devote some number of dollars to trying to divert asteroids.
Yeah, it's a very interesting discussion, but I think that I would like to ask the public as well, if anybody of you has one question, or if you want to contribute to this discussion. Is there any question? No, right? Okay, if not, then I would like to maybe ask Joanna to bring us back to our main topic, which is architecture somehow. So how can we now bring this discussion back to the cities and planning?
Yeah, the thing is that throughout today's presentations, the main words have been optimization, effectivity, and things like that. But those are topics that are more tied to the technology and to the production of spaces, but not the spatial strategies themselves. And yeah, with regard to that, I would like to ask that is smart cities idea really only about the software systems? And shouldn't we equally think how the hardware system, how the architectural environment could support it, and whether this needs some new concepts, because otherwise we might end up with like similar outcomes as during the last industrial revolution, where at some point just like those concrete apartment block areas seemed like the wisest thing to do, or it seems that the discussion was missing at the right point, and I'm a bit afraid that we are like doing the same mistake right now, just talking about all the opportunities but not acknowledging the threats.
I just want to applaud. I was just very excited, because it seems to be completely two different discourses, right? So okay, so let's take the city as it's given to us and make it more efficient, etc., as opposed to let's make it more aesthetically pleasing, more complex, more meaningful, which is what architects should be doing. But we haven't heard one thing about architecture today. So what's going on?
Yeah, maybe Jarmo would like to comment on that, as he has the background in both fields.
I think there is an issue, but I'm not sure if it's actually Lou proposed to me that Leva proposing that I would drop the word smart from the presentation and just talk about cities. That's a good proposal. I'm probably follow that. I think One aspect which does affect architecture a lot is the fact that the speed of change caused by technology in the ways we live, the ways we work, the professions, the businesses, is increasing. And that, of course, has an impact on what kind of spaces we should design. And that's maybe especially problematic for the sort of single-use buildings, which we maybe used to have more in the past and which might be a problem nowadays. Finland is full of chamber music halls. It's like packed with chamber music halls. Built in the 80s and early 90s, these white buildings with a nice classical music auditorium. And they are damn useless. Because most events which people want to organize in cities nowadays are not chamber music concerts or acoustic concerts or concerts per se. And these kind of spaces would be much better. And I think we have one such a house, which is Hämeenlinna Verkatehdas old warehouse building, which is turned into a cultural center, which is designed as a multi-purpose space which can host everything. And most of all the millions spent in those prestigious halls has been money down the drain. And I think that's one of the challenges for urban design. How do we build spaces which tolerate the change, maybe the unexpected? How do we design for the unexpected?
The beginning could be, for instance, like building the parking buildings in a different way, so that at a point where self-driving cars would take it over, they could be adapted to a new use, because the number would just be way smaller. Or I think we need way more spatial strategies to be ready for that.
One small example, which is actually nice example from Rem Koolhaas, which is the Manhattan blocks. The fact is that functions normally can fit in any kind of spaces if the spaces are robust enough. And if you think of a basic block in central Manhattan, it's like built all the way through, like this chunk of building, and they have lots of floors, and they can have anything in them. And there's a Chinese restaurant, and there's a seamstress shop, and there's a wholesale company for Chinese goods, and there's an insurance company, and there's administrators, and there's a metal shop, and etc., etc., stacked up. And the whole building is actually, the whole point of it are the functions. The building is just a frame.
Just to add something, so I think that humans in history, including urban planners, architects, have done very well in creating complex, unpredictable, kind of surprising flaneur environments, for things like ornament. And then, like in the Industrial Revolution happened, the first one, and basically architecture has failed. And we end up with basically we live in a planet of Khrushchevs, right? Khrushchev, kind of this concrete, disgusting buildings all over the world, especially in the developing world. So the question is, how do you kind of create economically complexity again, but for billions of people? We know how to do it for like 50 people. Can you use big data? I don't think a single person is working with, but it's probably the single most important problem for architecture. And yet, nobody ever discusses it, right? So what we discuss is like something else. Yeah. So how do we actually create nice architecture? I think it's much easier to talk about data because we know how to control it. We don't want to talk about architecture because, well, it's controlled by developers, so we have nothing, we can't do anything, right? But so that's like an easy way to out.
Okay.
Yeah.
What I wanted to ask was that it's clear that you are coming out with some kind of architectural operating system on top of what you can actually implement the applications. Is this kind of concept similar? But the other similar thing, we had some examples from the testing also, that you can do this early prototyping and testing, and whether we can actually somehow implement this kind of test in the buildings also. Is it possible?
Maybe one regarding to the developing world issue. I mean, one of the systemic failures which is going on at the moment, which is something I don't know if anyone can do anything about it, but China and several other places are building their cities following the US car city model. model. And that's an issue. That you, instead of building walkable cities, which can be big but consisting of sub-centers, like the European historical reasons we have those cities here, they are building these cities in which you can basically take a train or a car. And that is, of course, pretty unsustainable, which we have already seen. But I don't know if we can have any effect on that. It's somehow it seems that each society needs to repeat the same mistakes everybody else did before, even though there might be already a better path ahead.
So, sorry, can I ask a question right here? Hi. Two things. I think in the last presentation cycle, I think there was the term leapfrog. So in the sense, no, they don't have to repeat the same mistakes. If they, like you don't have to adapt the wire infrastructure if you can just jump to the wireless right away, right? Or to the mobile. So it's just a matter of thinking a little bit before you actually act on something. And then the second thing I think, or the question that I actually wanted to ask is, to Johanna, for example, like if you say that you build sorry, I'm in a very uncomfortable spot. But if you build the parking garage in such a way that you can later redesign it for, let's say, occupiable, livable space, then are we going towards more entropy again, like as you, Jarmo, said, but in space? Basically even more standardization than we have? That you can adjust any structure to any purpose at any given moment. Is that the freedom that we're looking for? Is that this? Or are we looking at something a little bit more scary, architecturally speaking?
Yes, standardization really isn't something that I was trying to pay focus on before. What I was trying to say is that as architects, and I think like around half of the audience is architects, we should put more effort in thinking of spatial strategies that are as innovative and as strategic as the software systems that we have been talking about today, because having been working on Ülemiste Smart City, for instance, that is, I think, the most rapidly growing smart city in the Baltic states, and I'm really happy to see that they have understood that architectural part of the smart city needs equal attention, and those competitions that have been done just within like usual architects who have the usual architectural background haven't been really successful, because you cannot just do architectural projects and say that everything is more innovative than in the usual one. It needs a new concept or a new idea behind than just like equipping it with all kinds of technology and tell that that's how it works.
I could comment on the leapfrogging. Actually, I sort of dwindled into pessimism. Sorry about that. Yes, I actually recognize that, and it is the potential way ahead. I think I also agree that the best way to support leapfrogging is to offer models which are replicable. So how do you do that? And I think, for example, work done by Kent Larsson's unit at MIT is interesting, because they design concepts which are not particularly tied to certain place or certain city, but which are scalable and replicable and possible to multiply. And I think that's those kind of directions are the ones we should take, because we can't be there to design everything, but we could offer models which can be used as a basis for local developers and architects to build more sustainable and more livable cities.
Stephen?
I'm not an architect, so I don't have an expert opinion on this, but I take Johanna's point. It's very true that a lot of people working on the software side of the smart city, it's almost like they're bored of the physical infrastructure, and they just want to create a sort of video game where you can instantly teleport from one place to another and more or less forget about what's actually there physically. And then we're talking about China designing cities around cars. One of the smartest ways to improve a city like London and smaller cities would be to pedestrianize city centers, and that's got nothing to do with computers at all.
That's right. Do we have more questions from the audience? Ivan, you want to continue, or?
I actually am holding the mic so that anybody could raise their hand and I could come up to them and they could ask a question. So, waiting for hands.
When we had 2 hours conversation, I'm sure you have one.
Still waiting for hands. Waiting for hands 1. Waiting for hands 2. I'm not going to say 3 because then that's a fail, right? All right, I'll ask something else which is a little bit different topic, but something that will end coming up probably more in the symposium anyway, is the lifespan of buildings. Again, when we put the life cycle of technology, which is super fast, you know, on the same timeline as the architectural development, right, which is decades long. So how do you synchronize those two? Do you just make, you know, as for example, Seth, I remember, who was speaking in the panel before this one, he said, you know, well, just leave more space for wires in your walls. You know, is that the best we can do, or is there some sort of an alternative to synchronizing this architectural space and, you know, data space, so to say? What do you think? Or somehow synchronizing the life cycles, basically. Is it even a solvable issue?
I don't know, but it just makes me think of, I just bought an apartment in London which was built only 10 years ago, and it's got this home networking media system all based on Ethernet with these points in every room. And it's like, you know, even 10 years ago they had no idea that everything would be Wi-Fi these days, so it's completely useless. You can't even figure out how to make it work, and I don't even, you know. So it's pointless to me. There are these sockets in the walls, you know, but they thought only 10 years ago that this was the future. But of course now it's just pointless. So, you know, that's the problem writ large in a whole city, is what you're talking about, right?
But that's amazing, though, because it starts almost reminding of the discourse of, you know, autonomy in architecture, right? Pretty much like it doesn't matter what you design, it will be occupied anyway. Something again I mentioned. Well, pretty much, you know, like it can be this building, right, which was not suited for this purpose initially, but here we are having an awesome conference here. So does it actually give us, what is it? Is it the standardization and the life cycle of buildings becoming, you know, up to 5 years, and then everything is being built with concrete, you know, the kind of the modular houses, just so that you can exchange them real fast? Or is it that we have total formal freedom, and then we just kind of fit the purpose into that formal freedom?
Well, this is now completely out of my head because I hadn't thought of this before, so excuse me if I'm utterly bullshitting you, but so the first reaction, first of all, it seems that buildings regularly outlive the ideas of the planners or constructors, especially in the last century and the latter half of last century. All the buildings which were designed to be there for 50 years still stand, most of them, and they will keep standing there regardless of how bad quality they were built in. So I don't think in replaceable buildings that much. But then I also don't believe, I absolutely believe in replaceable technology. Anything which is tech-driven is outdated in a few years. So nothing fixed should be installed in the buildings. It should be all somehow easy access, easy exchange, easy replacement kind of structures. Screens, cables, I mean, all those office buildings with umpteen miles of cables in the walls, which becomes obsolete in 2 or 3 years. So, and of course it's also very unsustainable because then all that copper just lies there. So, and there's no stopping that. We don't know which direction it takes, so we should just leave, maybe divide that part into quite sort of a technically driven installation spaces which are permanently there in all plans. So like we do theater spaces in a way.
So basically living spaces for new developments that we don't know, we're not aware of yet. So basically that could be one way of going.
But I trust a lot in the fact that functions adapt to the space. In the example from Helsinki, the cable factory, who's been there? Do you know the building? Some have. It's the old cable factory, damn big, 150,000 square meters or something in the middle of Helsinki, which was turned into a cultural center in the late 80s and early 90s. And at one point there's a big hall there called Sea Cable Hall. It's 100 meters long, 10 meters high and 10 meters wide. So it's very odd space. It's like a big arrow of space. And the designers thought that can't be used for anything. And there were plans to cut it in two and to make the other end of kindergarten and the other end of theater. And then money ran out because the recession came to Finland and it was left as it is. And now, today, the sea cable haul usage is almost 100% a year. Even though architects couldn't come up with a single use for it, it's being used 350 days a year from years to years for anything. For anything it can be used, from small weddings to massive fairs, different kinds of events. So spaces functions are quite adaptable to spaces, like this place proves actually.
Let's wrap it up, yeah.
From me, one comment actually about this wireless. Wireless is not making the wires obsolete. The wireless actually needs the very, very solid backbone actually lots of wire. And one thing actually what we can imagine also, what are those infrastructures that you need anyway. One possible thing that you can think is that if you are having people there, they have to breathe, they need water, they need sewage. Those kind of things are for granted. And other things, I think, you must be able to introduce the new infrastructure. What we don't know today is that what will all those self-driving things actually will do to us. Then they will be able to transport the goods actually to our doorsteps. But how this thing actually moves in the building? So no.
Maybe some closing words.
Well, I'm not sure about closing, but I can give you some words for sure.
Just keep going. Let's keep it going, right?
No, but just
I saw that thing
to
flashing there.
respond to a few points, like when you ask, I think, very interesting
With time,
question
that's good.
about can we do experiments in a kind of like building level, and also you ask about how should we build. Well, so one question I think to ask, which will maybe connect also the kind of data world and the architecture world, is okay, why we don't have a kind of a science of architecture, right? Okay. Because so I think, right, so one thing which kind of happened, and I did talk about this also a bit in other people, is that people are meeting data traces, right, or social media content, and we can collect it, and then we can do something with data. And as I said, in terms of cultural studies, for the first time it allows us to study what you can call reception. But you can also say that for the first time, we can actually study on a massive level the use, how people receive, i.e. use building and build environment. So I think so far what we see, right, is that people collect data in computer science, urban studies, etc., and then maybe it's used to, I don't know, make better certain things, and some of these things are physical, maybe like we have these buses going around, or you optimize traffic lights. But hypothetically, right, you can collect the data about the lives, satisfaction levels, disappointments of hundreds of millions of people across many thousands of cities. And hypothetically, if you follow the idea of science, you can collect enough data if you have the right data. I mean, I'm not sure. You probably can, but hypothetically, and then you can say, okay, this is we actually have now a science of architecture. So if you have to build this in this particular situation, given its variables, that's what you should build, right? I mean, this is what we have engineering, pretty much, right? Because I think right now architectural kind of study is like basically a bunch of competing theory. You go and you study urbanism. So, well, there's 5 different theories how to build a city. Here's pro and cons, and nobody can agree. And then, of course, what happens, what gets built, depends on people's ambition, politics, etc. Now, I'm not saying that we should have a science of architecture, but on the other hand, it may be not a bad idea hypothetically to think about it. So what will actually happen if you collect enough data points about the lives of, hundreds of millions of people? You're probably going to learn a lot of things, at least which architects and urban planners don't know, because it's not going to be based on particular kind of case studies, right? So that's one, I think, thing which to me sounds very logical at the intersection of architecture and data, which actually didn't really, I think, not really happening yet as far as I know.
One way to do it is actually to run the stress tests. So what you are doing is that you're optimizing to the one solution.
You can think of different cities as a kind of as tests, right?
Yeah,
as tests.
and simulate it and run the stress test. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, sorry. Just it's funny though, because we were just talking about how life accepts spaces the way they are and then makes them their own. But at the same time, the smart city paradigm says that everything has to be efficient, which means that every single bolt serves its purpose perfectly, everything's calculated,
But
everything's
it doesn't
predetermined.
mean that it has to look efficient, it just has to be produced efficiently. But space-wise, the spatial quality shouldn't be optimized. Like the tools actually allow you to consider all the complexity, all the data of the users of the buildings, to take all of this into account. And I think it's like really important to emphasize this, that from the architect's point of view, efficiency and optimization are not the main words, but the main words would be like algorithmic complexity, and just forget these words because they are just the parts of production.
Yeah, exactly.
But maybe I would like to ask to Joanna. So there is this, for instance, there is Amazon, right, that they used users' data of Kindle to see what kind of parts of the book people read the most, and also
Excuse me, what did I use?
the data of Kindle to see what kind of pages people are flipping quicker than others. So, and they can even rewrite the content of books, which means basically having this kind of feedback process. And the same, actually, we are doing it, even myself, I'm doing it in my practice. We are looking at Instagram pictures or Twitter data to kind of understand how people perceive architecture. And this, again, can be used in the same way as a feedback process to redesign architecture. So do you think that architecture should follow this logic or not? I mean, do you think that architects should use this data to redesign the city in the same way that Amazon redesigned the books? Or do you think that architecture should completely ignore it and go on its own way?
I don't think that architecture should just take the, for instance, Amazon pattern, but I think that those technological improvements, they bring new behavioral patterns along, and architects should take those new behavioral patterns into account, so that, for instance, the pictures that you, Stephen, had in the presentation about the smart city, that was just a background image, but they shouldn't actually look like just skyscrapers on the field, as we can see like in every smart city campus. It should be something where you can see that there are new connections, or, I mean, I don't think that we should like really focus on how the drone balcony would look like before it's really there, but the best that architects can do is like focus on the most topical things of the day.
To me, the city is the people who live this society, and those buildings, they are just frame for those people.
Yeah, but it should support the people's activity. Yeah.
Can I just say something? Well, so before I said, but we can't be intellectuals because of insurance companies. But you had a great answer. And so I think that we can't be good architects or urban designers because of banks and the idea of ownership. Because we only have two models now in this planet. Either you get the loan and you pay something, so with huge amounts of money involved, or you get some kind of city apartment from a government, where it is Communist Russia or Singapore. And this is right. This is basically makes experimentation, the kind of things you want to talk about, or what Google does with A/B testing, kind of impossible. Like imagine we have some hypothetical city in a place like Finland, where the people have we get some units, and when you can spend these units to live in this apartment, go to this apartment, so different models of kind of how the cities, how the people in their dwelling spaces get connected. Besides these two kind of somewhat idiotic models, and then we can actually have interesting, I think, cities. So burn the banks and burn subsidized city apartments.
I think that the comparison with Amazon Kindle is fascinating for me as mainly a book reviewer and somebody who writes books. Because if you took Amazon's data about what people keep reading and what they give up on and what people in the mass really like, and if you took all that data and used it to construct a book, you'd come up with the worst potboiler, thriller rubbish, the lowest common denominator. So if you apply that strategy to architecture, I don't know, or any field, aren't you just going to be pandering to the lowest common denominator, pandering to what people already do, to what they already like, pandering to prejudices? And the opposite view is expressed, for instance, by Steve Jobs before he died. He famously said, "I don't believe in market research. I want to give people things they don't already know they want."
Yeah, that's interesting, and maybe could that be the reason why this phenomenon of the flaneur does not exist anymore? Could it be that already the city, it is started to follow that logic? Could it be that London and Berlin and other cities have already followed the feedback
Could be,
logic
because
of
yes,
Amazon?
if you design those monoliths just pointing towards the kind of places that everybody already goes, then you're funneling people into this sort of rigid preset paths. I mean, of course, you know, some people used to do that in the days before, you know, smartphones. They'd get out their guidebook and they'd like tick off the top 3 places in the guidebook everywhere they go. And other people prefer just to go and find a cafe and sit down and watch the street life go by. But, you know, there's a danger of, you know, pandering to people rather than challenging them with something new, which they would enjoy if only you did it. But if you're kind of frightened to do it because it doesn't fit in with what you already know from the data,
right.
then maybe the world becomes, you know, more predictable and less interesting.
But I think you're right, but I think, you know, yeah, if you let people design their own houses, I mean, yeah, basically it's going to be these little castles. With like,
You're going to see it here,
yeah,
actually.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. But when you say people, okay, what about the city? Like, what urban structure we should have? We may not have an answer, right? So I think on some other levels, actually learning about how cities work may be very useful, right? Because there are certain patterns which are also maybe invisible to people, right? You know, which we don't see. So, but you're right. No, I don't want to. I mean, we should basically take best Scandinavian designs and force everybody to build only with designs. I mean, that could be nice.
All right. Maybe if you want to conclude, because then we need to wrap
Okay,
up.
I just say that I don't believe in algorithm design done by algorithms. I believe in design helped by algorithms, certainly can, but it's utterly more complex process than just interpreting data. It's a combination of empathy, vision, and skill, and it's not something which you can just interpret out of statistics. Statistics, because statistics always show the past. And yet we should be designing for the future, so they don't necessarily help you in that. And last point, I actually learned to like the fact that the word architecture is used both for architecture and for data structures. They have much more in common than sometimes I would have thought.
Okay, thank you. So I think that I would like to ask everybody if there is one last question from the public. No, I don't. I have lights, so I cannot see. Right? No, not even one. Okay. Yeah, there is one. Okay. I think there is more than one.
I actually don't have a question. I have a comment about the question that Ivan had, that we're laying down some wires and for 5 years from now they're obsolete and stuff. But, and I think Mr. Priisalu can correct me, but isn't that in Estonia about 30% of households get their internet via cables that were laid down, copper wires, like 70 or 80 years ago, and they get 12 megabits out of it or something like that. So the cables were laid down during Konstantin Päts' time, and they're still using it. So.
And we also have internet in Old Town, and like, yeah, study architecture in the old warehouse. So just to support what you said.
Yes, please.
And, thank you. And from where is coming this architecture, or what software engineers learned from the architects, that there are actually some kind of frameworks and some things that will stay, and there are some things that are decorations that you will actually change very, 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 very often. And who are the real architects? Who are the developers? Developers are those kinds of guys actually who are writing those rules, and architects are the people who are thinking what are the big frames actually that will be shared by the developers.
Okay, thank you very much for the very interesting conversation, and that's why I'm sure that there are more questions. And for this reason, we will have a coffee break. So I would like first to thank everybody. So a great applause to our participants for you coming here. And of course, I would like to thank Ivan for the great event. I mean, he set up this thing magnificently. I think this is one of the best one ever been. So an applause to Ivan, please. Thank you. And to close, actually, as you all know, Estonia has been developing quite a lot of policies and even technologies to develop the concept of e-Estonia, so the e-society. And that's why here, I'm going to give you an ID card reader. And of course, you might even have, some of you, And with this one, you will be capable to access all of your information in case you decide, for instance, to become an e-resident of Estonia, right? Okay, thank you very much, and let's continue the conversation in the coffee break.